Good evening, everyone. Welcome to PS 6110 WNW-WR, otherwise known as Political Science 6110 World News Worldly with Ryan. I'm your host, Ryan. Tonight, we take ourselves over into the Ukraine and Russia. There's been a conflict brewing since 2014, and I think it's important for our viewers to know exactly what has been going on. For Russia, the Crimean Peninsula has always been a highly coveted territory. Unfortunately, and despite numerous attempts by Russia, Ukraine has retained direct ownership of the region. When President Putin of Russia determined he would achieve what no other Russian leader had done, it was inevitable. Crimea would become Russian once again. There's inherent belief among Russian leaders that the rightful owner of the Crimean Peninsula is Russia. Therefore, it was celebrated in the winter of 2014 when President Putin initiated his plan to regain Crimea. The successful accession of the territory by President Putin happened strategically and at precisely the right moment when Ukraine was in turmoil. Eventually, this led to widespread violent protests. And after several state security protest suppressions became violent, more protesters began to arrive. Escalation of the internal conflicts within Ukraine forced President Yankovych to flee the country in February of 2014. Soon after that, pro-Russian protests broke out that involved masked gunmen storming the Crimean parliament building and raising the Russian flag. Pro-Russian lawmakers dismissed the outbreak at the parliament building, and subsequently they appointed Sergei Aksyonov, a Russian Unity Party member, as the prime minister of Crimea. President Putin exploited this vulnerable moment for Ukraine by invading the peninsula. The Russian president justified his actions by acting in the name and protection of the ethnic Russians that call the peninsula their home, and the military assets as well that are based in Sevastopol. However, it became clear that President Putin's motives for moving Russian forces into Crimea were born out of his desires to acquire the territory. Although the troops marching into Crimea were marked Russian Special Forces soldiers, it was later determined that many of the men involved in the protests were also Russian soldiers despite their lack of Russian military insignias. As of April 2021, Russia is in control of Crimea. Russia maintains a presence in the territory as well, but they have also increased the number of deployed troops along the Crimean-Ukrainian border. Although the escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine are closely monitored within the international relations community, it remains relatively unknown to those outside of this circle. Their potential world-changing repercussions should relations between Russia and Ukraine break down, should Ukraine and Russia's conflicts over Crimea continue and intensify, it's only a matter of time before the isolated fighting turns into a sustained war. Although it is a sobering reality, any potential war between Ukraine and Russia could ultimately result in a global war between Western civilization and Russia. How did we get here? Here's the history. The Crimean Peninsula is rich with Russian history and has always been a highly coveted territory by Russia. The peninsula provides several military advantages for Russia, and additionally, many Russians living in the peninsula have strong ethnic and cultural ties to the former Soviet Union. Until their loss of the Crimean War in 1865, Russia maintained a naval base in Sevastopol. However, the Russians maintained relations with the entire territory. Periodically, Russian leaders would return to the Crimean city, and Joseph Stalin even was instrumental in rebuilding the city after World War II, left most of it in ruins. However, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia entered into a treaty with Ukraine that allowed them to maintain a base of operations for the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol until 2042. In 2014, the citizens of Crimea held a referendum. They agreed that secession from Ukraine was the best path forward. The referendum was held almost immediately after Russia had gained control over the territory. March 6th vote from the Crimean Supreme Council asked for permission to succeed to Russia. A subsequent referendum was scheduled for March 16th. There were two choices on that ballot: return to Russia or reinstate Crimea's 1992 constitution establishing autonomy for the peninsula. However, there was no voting option for those who wanted Crimea to remain a part of Ukraine under their current constitution. The annexation is an international violation. Although the Crimean Peninsula geographically remains in Ukraine, it was annexed by Russia in a 2014 referendum not recognized by international law. The international community condemned the annexation of the territory for multiple reasons. The first reason world leaders expressed in their condemning of the annexation was the legality of Russia's actions. Russia was quick to interfere in the Ukrainian protests after President Yankovych was ousted in 2013 for exiting economic discourse with the European Union. President Putin leveraged the protest as a means to justify Russian military involvement. Russia claimed they were moving into the Crimean Peninsula to protect their military assets in Sevastopol and to protect the ethnic Russian majority that populated the Crimean region. Russia is allowed to maintain a continued military presence of approximately 25,000 troops in their naval bases. Therefore, it was not a far-fetched theory that they were protecting military assets. However, these actions were condemned and questioned because Russia would gain a strategic advantage if they had unrestricted access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean via the Sevastopol base. Additionally, there are legitimate theories that propose Russia may have been laying the groundwork for the argument to invade Crimea in defense of these ethnic Russians for years. Russia began a mass passportization of Crimea in 2008. However, Russia even issued 143,000 passports to Ukrainian citizens in the weeks leading up to the 2014 invasion. Despite military intervention and the acquisition of strategic military positions, the major component of the annexation that attributed to a violation of international law was the absence of a unified vote. All citizens of Ukraine did not vote on the succession of Crimea. The citizens of Ukraine outside of the peninsula were not allowed to vote on the annexation. Thus, legality was raised because the Ukrainian constitution demands that any changes to the Ukrainian territory are to be confirmed by a vote of a referendum to all Ukrainians. The constitutional requirement is consistent with international law and recognizes states' sovereignty and territorial integrity. Furthermore, these principles do not recognize any succession rights by a group or region unless there are proven human rights violations. Despite disagreements from the international community, there was little they could do. Russia vetoed a resolution from the UN Security Council that called the referendum invalid. Russia, as we all know, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and if any of the 5 permanent members use their right to veto power, the resolution is automatically denied. After Russia vetoed the UN resolution, they wasted little time in acquiring Crimea. Notwithstanding the pleas from the international community, Russia moved forward to annex the territory as quickly as possible. President Putin and Crimean leaders moved to sign the succession treaty despite the public dissent of others. The Kremlin declared that the treaty was effective immediately, although it did await official ratification by parliament. While speaking during his signing of the succession treaty, President Putin, made several pro-Russian arguments to justify the acquirement of the territory. The president's points included a belief that the territory of Crimea should have been redistributed to Russia during the 1991 dissolving of the Soviet Union. Additionally, the president spoke about his fear that Ukraine would join NATO, leaving Russia's Black Sea naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea in an untenable position. Despite the agreement between Russia and Crimea, Ukraine refused to accept the legitimacy of the signed treaty. Ukraine rejected the notion of an independent Crimea and the agreement for the territory to join the Russian Federation. Despite Ukraine's refusal to acknowledge the loss of Crimea and the numerous disagreements from the international community, Russia still retains control of the territory today. Since Russia has annexed the Crimean territory, numerous changes have taken place among the population, the economy, and the landscape. Now that Russia retains control, upwards of 250,000 Russians have moved into the region, and approximately 140,000 ethnic Ukrainians have left the region due to unfair treatment and prejudice from Russians. Economically, however, the territory is at a crossroads. Russia has poured large quantities into the development of the Crimean infrastructure. Some estimates place Russian investments upwards of $10 billion to develop highways, railroads, and a coveted bridge that crosses the Kerch Strait to link Crimea directly to Russia. Unfortunately, the Crimean tourist industry has been in constant decline since the Russian takeover. More important than the economic implications of the Russian takeover in Crimea is the military landscape and political relations between the two countries. Essentially, the conflict between the two countries has 2 different narratives. From a Ukrainian perspective, it is evident Russia is steadily building up troops along the border. On the other hand, Russia has maintained that anyone in the region in a military capacity is strictly a volunteer. Additionally, Russia has consistently armed separatists to help fight against Ukrainians in the eastern parts of Ukraine. Regardless, though, The increase in Russian troops along the Ukrainian border has kept tensions between the two countries steadily increasing since the beginning of the conflict. The Ukraine Russian conflict has gradually become more hostile in 2021, however. Russia continues to use military aggression to bully its way along the Ukrainian border in the Donbas region. It's undeniable that a steady buildup of Russian military forces has been happening. Ukrainians have watched as Russian ships have moved into Ukrainian waters and troops amassed within Russian controlled territories. From Ukraine's perspective, Russia's actions appear to be acts of aggression, but Russians believe they're acting in defense. Russia maintains that the increase of Russian military units to the region is in response to NATO and Ukraine troop buildup in conflict regions. Still, all signs point to a potential war between the two countries. Ukraine is prepared for war. Russian troops have been spotted moving within separatist controlled territories to draw Ukrainian forces away from their posts. It was expected that Russia would perform immense offensive maneuvers through the separatists located in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The proposed tactic would allow President Putin to declare that the fighting was an internal Ukrainian affair to hide Russian involvement. It is evident to the West that Russia may have more nefarious intentions. President Joe Biden has made phone calls to President Putin urging him the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty. The pleas for peace may seem futile to some officials in Washington, D.C. General Hodges, with the Center for European Policy Analysis, proclaims that there is no Russian interest in a Ukrainian peace, but instead, they wish to keep the country destabilized. Ukraine has made strategic defensive maneuvers to prepare for the possibility of a Russian attack. At the start of the conflict, Ukraine cut off the water supplies from rivers to Crimea. This tactic has led to an instability of fresh water to many within the region. However, this past February, Russian military units performed military exercises with paratrooper units targeting water canals along the Dnieper River, which supplies water to Crimea. The Ukrainian military responded by performing their own exercises to defend the flatland region from a hypothetical air and sea attack. Still, the conflict has hit a critical level. As of April 2021, Russia has drastically begun building up its forces more so than it has done so in the past. Although usually the muscle flexing show of force is not uncommon for Russia, this time around, things are different. President Putin's military is deploying its forces in a much more overt nature than they have ever done so in the past. The director of the CIA is monitoring the situation closely. Although Congress is informed, the director is unsure of precisely what is going on because this event feels more ominous than before. It is unclear if the current event is leveraged to warn the West to remain out of the conflict. Analysts theorize this could be a test for the new president, Joe Biden. The warning is potentially in response to the recent sanctions President Biden has placed on Russia for the solar wind hackings, as well as for Russian involvement in Ukraine. The U.S. military's European command is monitoring the situation closely. In response to Russian troop deployments, the U.S. military European command raised watch levels from possible crisis to the highest level, potential imminent crisis. Perhaps, however, Russia may not be concerned with the opinions of the West, but instead may be attempting to display Russia's military powers to force Ukraine to concede to Russian demands. Regardless, world leaders recognize the urgency of the situation and take all precautions relating to Russia and Ukraine affairs. President Joe Biden has made it clear he does not wish to escalate the situation with Russia. However, Russian officials maintain they are within their rights to station troops however they see fit within their own borders. There are very few outcomes from the Ukraine-Russian conflict that do not result in violence. There are only two viable, peaceful solutions that may happen. The first scenario involves a Russian concession and a withdrawal from both Ukraine territories, but additionally, the Crimean Peninsula. Although this is the most unlikely to happen, considering Russia's dedication to retaining control of Crimea, this scenario would ensure total peace if a mutual agreement could be reached between Russia and Ukraine. Second, Russia leaves the Ukrainian border it has occupied. Putin condemns separatists fighting against Ukraine, but Russia retains control of Crimea. There are some good aspects and negative aspects to this more than likely scenario. If Russia leaves the Ukrainian border, it will obviously ease the tensions and prevent potential military conflict. However, it is unlikely that President Putin would condemn separatist fighting against Ukraine. Additionally, Russia would likely remain in Crimea. The previously described scenario seems to be the most likely. However, The possibility of President Putin denouncing separatists is still highly unlikely. Collectively, world leaders can agree they wish for a peaceful resolution to the escalating Ukraine and Russia clash. However, there is potential for a military conflict to break out. As it stands, Russia has become less concerned with hiding their buildup of troops and more concerned with defending the territories they believe they are entitled to have. If militaries become more involved and fighting ensues, there are two potential outcomes for the types of war that might happen. A civil war with Ukraine at the hands of Russia is highly probable. Civil wars, after all, are the most prevalent style of conflict on the planet. Additionally, there are clear transnational linkages that contribute to the likelihood of interstate conflict. Ukraine has several risk factors that provide enough evidence to cause concerns for an outbreak of a civil war. Within Ukraine, there are multiple different ethnic groups, including native Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Russians. We know that the more transboundary ethnic groups increase a country's risk of conflict. The possibilities of civil war become more realistic considering these factors and President Putin's belief that it is within Russia's rights to protect Russian citizens no matter where their geographic location is. It is not uncommon for Russia to indulge in civil wars outside of its territory. Russia has been instrumental to the Assad regime in Syria throughout its civil war. Therefore, if a civil war breaks out in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and ethnic Russians living there, there's a strong likelihood that President Putin will involve the entire Russian country. Additionally, there are further security concerns for the region outside of a potential civil war in Ukraine. A statistical analysis of interstate and intrastate conflicts suggests civil wars cluster around one another. Wars cluster around one another because states that border others at war are more likely to experience conflict. A civil war in Ukraine could contribute to civil wars and instability in the Slavic region. Moreover, instability in this region would legitimize Russian beliefs that a modern day expansion of their state through hostile takeovers of other nations is necessary to protect any ethnic Russians within the Slavic states. Civil war is not the only possible military conflict liable to break out from the Ukraine conflict. Considering the recent increase of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border and the numerous training exercises, it appears as if Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. President Putin would justify a Russian invasion to protect any Russians or Russian assets inside of Ukraine. It is apparent to world leaders, military officials, and intelligence analysts that President Putin has a disregard for the sanctions and precautionary measures world governments have attempted to place on Russia to prevent further aggression. If Russia is not scared to show the world its hand, then perhaps everyone's fears are genuine. Perhaps Russia wants to begin a war. However, a war with Ukraine will quickly escalate into a war between Western civilization and Russia. Ukraine has expressed interest in joining NATO. Therefore, it is almost guaranteed that an unjustified military conflict between Ukraine and Russia would involve NATO forces. Though it is unclear what stance the United States' new presidential administration would take, it is more likely than not that the US would involve itself in the conflict. President Joe Biden has expressed concerns for Russian aggression and has placed several sanctions on the state as well. A war between Russia and US-backed NATO forces to defend Ukraine would be costly. Though, with a conflict of this magnitude, Russia would undoubtedly involve other powerful countries for support, such as China, Iran, Syria. Although extreme to insinuate a world war could result from the Ukraine-Russian conflict, even the slightest chance that multiple world powers involve themselves in this conflict should cause significant concern for world security. Despite Russia's inability to express its true intentions behind the meticulous military buildup in Ukraine, it appears to the rest of the world that Russia has a more malicious intention than President Putin is willing to share. Russia's intentions could potentially lead to a war between Russia and the West. A civil war in Ukraine is a genuine concern as well. Many ethnic Russians still comprise major areas within Ukraine, and therefore there is a strong potential for a conflict between the ethnic Russians in Ukraine and the ethnic Ukrainians. World leaders have attempted many solutions to reason with Russia and prevent their continued aggression. However, each one has failed. Multiple countries, including the United States, Ukraine, and even NATO, have all attempted to sanction Russia. Additionally, numerous red lines were established as areas where Russia is not permitted to cross. However, those have also failed. If the international community wishes to stop Russia, we must stop allowing Russia to gain more territory. A rigid stance against Russian aggression must happen. A final red line should prevent Russian advancement, and if Russia crosses it, they must be dealt with severely. An effective response from all nations requires everyone to be cohesive to address Russia. All nations need to unilaterally agree that military intervention is the only step to prevent further Russian aggression. Additional sanctions should begin if there is a hard target date for Russians to withdraw from any established autonomous zones. However, Russia has displayed a complete disregard for sanctions, and contingencies must be in place should this continue. If they fail to draw down by the established date, then military intervention must be the next step. Eastern Europe cannot afford to allow Russia to become a modern day conqueror. If Russia conquers Ukraine, what will stop them from claiming territories they believe to be inherently Russian or invading territories to protect ethnic Russians? Russia cannot afford to enter into a world conflict against NATO, however. Conversely, the West cannot afford to allow the conflict to reach a level requiring military intervention. It is incredibly urgent that world leaders seek diplomacy and peaceful resolutions for both Ukraine and Russia. However, there is a viable argument that the world may have already entered into a modern day Cold War with Russia. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen on the Crimean Russian conflict, and hopefully this is resolved fairly soon. As for me, I'm Ryan Meguiar. You have a good night, world.